Welcome to High Noon, where we talk about controversial subjects with interesting people. And I'm so pleased this week to have Helen Roy on. Helen Roy is one of my favorite writers on the subjects of family, femininity, and sex, among others. She's a contributing editor to Claremont Institute's The American Mind, and she hosts a podcast called Girlboss Interrupted. She also has a new newsletter for New Founding called American Woman. So, welcome, Helen.
Thank you for having me.
So I wanted to start us off with sort of the question of your podcast, which is, sort of beating up on the girl boss archetype, right? And it almost feels a little bit like mean at this point because it
Yeah.
seems like the girl boss is very cringy and unpopular.
She's a
But
bit of a dead horse, yes.
I'm wondering, how it went from a sort of cultural phenomenon to a kind of insult,
Yeah.
how that happened, and then what it means now that this archetype, like what killed this archetype, what killed the girl boss, and what does it mean that it seems like beyond just our folks on the right, this is now an insult, girl boss.
Yes, that's a great question. Well, I think that honestly, some of it is like intergenerational violence. Gen Z is pretty intent on differentiating themselves from millennials who are cringe, and it's sort of their ascendancy now. They are the youth. They are sort of dictating the culture because that's how our culture works. That the youngest and sexiest among us get to say what's what, which I'm not upset about because I think it's something that like it's a meme that deserves to just probably be beaten down and at the very least forgotten. But there were material and practical reasons why this sort of thing fell apart too. So I think the girl boss thing. You could even say it started in like the mid 70s when women in the workforce went from just below they crossed the threshold from 49 to 50%. And that was really when that wave of feminism that was focused on not just being present in the career, but sort of being like a boss and achieving status in the working world was ascendant. But it really like those sort of ideas were marinating for a while, and then I think in the 90s, especially when the 80s and the 90s really. Well, in the 80s you see it too with like the fashion, the padded shoulders, and all that. But anyway, I think people who grew up in the 80s and 90s, women especially, at that point it had really this sort of particular brand of feminism had subsumed all aspects of life, and it became like a narrative for raising children. And so this cohort of women born in the 80s and 90s, millennials, were saturated in this like girl power thing, and then they grew up believing this wholeheartedly, and originally the self-identification, the hashtag girl boss thing in the early days of Instagram stuck and made sense because it was millennials' time and they were defining the trends. But over time, I think millennials aged into a situation where they became pretty exhausted by living by that life script, because it was so careerist and so insistent on equality with men that it insisted on behaviors that were the same as male behaviors, and just I think acting in a way that wasn't lined up with female nature. Just anybody will do that. Happens to anybody, right? If you're not sort of behaving in a way that's true and aligned and sort of properly oriented, it just falls apart because that's how the natural law works. So I think that's kind of what happened is like millennials grew up, and as they were sort of aging out of cultural relevancy, they were simultaneously losing steam personally. And so that's sort of where we are.
Yeah, I think that's really true, especially during the pandemic, and we'll get to that. But I this always makes me think of a truly emblematic anecdote. Actually, just a little bit older, I think, 'cause this is from Sex and the City, but Sex and the City is largely about Gen X, right? Um, and where the girls in Sex and the City are complaining about girls in their 20s, right, from the perspective of being in their mid 30s. And I can't remember which one says to which, but one of them is like, these girls in their 20s, they think they're it. And the other one says, yeah, don't they know that we're still it? And I think that like really encaptures this like millennial sort of desperation for what you called like the sort of sex appeal of being the youthful generation. Millennials are not adjusting well to not being it
Mhm.
anymore.
Mhm.
But I do fear that our cultural dominance actually will continue because simply the generation is so huge in the same way
Mhm.
that boomers. I mean, there was that very clear cultural handoff moment at the Super Bowl last year, right? Where for the first time, the halftime show it was geared explicitly at nostalgia for millennials. Boomers had such an outside impact on pop culture and on our culture more generally, I think, because they were the biggest generation to date. Well, we're bigger than
Mhm.
they are. Um, so the world may validate the marketing world out of pure capitalist greed may validate millennials' delusions that they're still it.
Yeah.
But I the deeper question here would be because you said I think it's so true that sort of especially the elder cohort of millennials feels like they're running out of steam with all the things that they were once very dedicated to, not just the girl bossing thing, but the quote unquote changing the world. So many of these sort of millennial tropes or generational tropes. I think a lot of those did kind of die an unnatural death very quickly during the pandemic, right?
Mhm.
Where people were obviously a lot of people working from home, very, very isolating. Um, some people leaned into work and they were working 16-hour days because there was nothing else to do. But now we have this phenomenon of burnout on the flip side of that. Other people probably looking at their work and saying, "Is this it?" Like without going out for brunch or seeing my friends at work or like having the sort of distraction around this life fundamentally made it difficult for people not to see it for the sort of emptiness that came with that kind of life. And here I'm thinking of that famous cover, right? Was it like a New Yorker cover or whatever with the girl
Mhm.
on the Zoom date with the cocktail and then she's got like pills on the ground and stuff everywhere.
Yeah.
um was it the pandemic that killed off finally this archetype because it just couldn't survive the kind of promises of that couldn't survive the loneliness of being locked in your house?
Did coronavirus kill the girl boss is the question. Yes, I think that it was the nail in the coffin for all of the reasons that you've already hinted at. Um, I think that, um, I had a guest on my podcast. Her name is Dr. Jennifer Roback Morse. She wrote a book called The Sexual State about how the government and media sort of hold up these artificial and contra nature sexual mores because they have to, because things would fall apart much more quickly if there weren't a state to enforce certain things and propaganda to sort of keep the wheels turning. So I think that that's true for a lot of memes, and there are a lot of unnatural memes that require a certain structure in order to stay alive. And I think that coronavirus really disrupted a lot of those structures and laid bare the truth of various institutions when all the, not just the bells and whistles, but like I say structure, I would say, man, how would I describe that? Just the formality was taken away. Like all you have left is the sort of raw substance, and you can sort of see it for what it is. Um, so I think that sort of that happened for a lot of millennial women. I would say definitely for the ones who had made their career like their primary identity. Um, they sort of were forced to take a step back, and all of a sudden it's like this all-consuming loneliness and a real like loss of identity for women then who have children, who it's like a slightly different thing. I think that a lot of women who have children who previously would have just sort of schlepped their kids to daycare and worked, and that was sort of an invisible, like the domestic work of raising children was just this invisible thing that was outsourced. When that was no longer a thing, and they were, interacting with their kids in a more intimate way, I guess. I think that did one of two things, really. I think that that either revealed to women, like, well, just how much they were missing out on by not being with their children, and it made them sad and made them reevaluate and want to sort of turn inward toward the home and be more present, or it really was debilitating and they were stretched too thin and they couldn't get out of the house again fast enough. And I guess the truth of that whole situation didn't completely make itself clear, or at least wasn't motivating enough to inspire change. But anyway, so there are a couple of different reactions, but in short, I do agree with you. I think that the pandemic was the nail in the coffin for that meme, and for the public school meme and a lot of other things. So
yeah, I guess as you're talking, I'm wondering whether, because we talk a lot about, and by we I mean people on the right, people who are, especially I think women, engaged on these kind of questions of sort of society and sex. We tend to focus a lot on the ideological, right? You were talking that the propaganda the state supports that you're talking about, and how we can rearrange some of those things, maybe to not make life obviously smooth sailing or perfect, but to maybe undo some of the harmful incentives that have been put in place. But how much of this is going the other way around? In other words, how much of this is cope for the things that we now lack, right? I've had Mary Eberstadt on this podcast. I think you have as well, right?
yeah, amazing.
How much of this ideology is necessary, is a necessary rationalization for women who just don't have the same opportunities for things that actually statistically do make women more fulfilled and happy, because of either economic factors or family breakdown of their own parents, of the boomer generation. I mean, what percentage of this is actively propagandized, or is even forgetting about propaganda, is just an actual ideology that people are governing their lives with, and how much of it is just cope? It's backwards cope for the reality that you're describing people facing in this pandemic, which is that people are lonely.
Oh, that is such a good point. It's hard to say. It's sort of a chicken and an egg thing, as are so many cultural things. It's sort of hard to pinpoint which domino was the first one to fall. Was the girl bossification of the American woman what led to loneliness, is loneliness what led to the girl bossification of the American woman? That, honestly, I don't know. I really don't know. I think that I think many things can be true at once, and these things do sort of feed each other. So yeah, I think that's true. I mean, I think that there's a considerable amount of cope, and it's I don't even. So as much as I sort of beat up on the meme, I don't like to beat up on individual women, and I think that most people are really just doing the best with the information that they have, and so I'm more critical of like institutions, of propaganda. So yeah, I don't know if people are coping through this. I would say, like through with careerism, in the same way that if you were coping with, I don't know, alcoholism. Obviously, they're not the same thing, right? Like one is way more damaging. But
I'm not sure which, actually.
Yeah. Fair. But I don't know. I think it's time that women especially took a long look in the mirror, we need to contend with our legacy as women, and the ways that our behavior, even if it's something that makes us feel good or feel confident or feel empowered in the moment, sets a precedent for future generations, to not have as many options, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think you're pointing to the fact that there isn't really a neutral message that can be sort of wrangled from this. Society's always going to have some kind of default about the good life, and particularly as in the context of this conversation, is going to have a default about what the good life looks like for a woman.
Mm-hmm.
And our societal default is very, very much in the girl boss direction still, as sort of cringy as the meme has become. It's also, even for Gen Z and for the generation after that, I don't see any indication, for example, that it's going to be culturally acceptable for smart and ambitious young women to skip college, have a family, and come back potentially to some kind of career later in life. I'm not seeing those kind of avenues open up in any really fundamentally different way than when we were 16.
Yes, so true.
So I don't know. I mean, I guess I do wonder what'll happen when the consequences of this become fully clear. I mean, we had the pandemic as kind of a preview, but millennial women are going to be the lowest percentage married and having children. I think close to 50% of millennial women will probably never marry and have children statistically.
Mm.
What sort of how society reacts to that, whether it's seen as something to justify or as a cautionary tale, I still don't know. But I'm curious what kind of feedback you've gotten, especially since you do write about these subjects so often, particularly from women who are younger than us, if they think that this kind of millennial introspection, this in the best case, kind of holding themselves out as cautionary tales and saying, look, this didn't
Mhm.
really work out for me. This didn't really make me happy. Do you see that having an impact, or do you see us being sort of unwise older sisters?
Well, great question. So, to one of your earlier points, I just want to emphasize and agree with that because it was a good one. The Gen Z criticism of millennials, for the most part, of the girl boss thing, is aesthetic. It's purely, it's the aesthetic is cringe, but the philosophy, it's not. The critique is not to the level of philosophy, and this because Gen Z women are just as, if not more, um, demeaning toward mothers and motherhood than their unwise older sisters. um, so, but and sorry, what? And your second question was: do you think that is there going to be a real change here? Is there a change in the youth, or do you? Okay, so I think that to the extent that that culture is shifting, it's going to be a very radicalized minority who responds. And over a long enough timeline, those people will simply outbreed the ones who are more nihilistic. But I don't even know if we'll ever live to see that. So I don't know. I don't know about mass culture. I think that as far as the masses go, we might be a little too far gone. I don't think there's ever been a civilization that survived the sort of tendencies that ours is falling into currently. But I think that there are enough people who are going to react strongly enough to sort of build out a little balkanized enclave for themselves, and the future will be interesting times. Probably hard too.
Well, I mean, I suppose every future is hard and every past is hard, but you know, I guess I'm wondering if the reaction to your work in particular, if you do get
Mm.
a reaction from younger women or from women, I'm assuming you're a millennial. I don't know why I assumed that, but
Well, I'm kind of on the I don't know. I was born in 1995, which is I mean, I'm married to a millennial. I'm probably spiritually more of a millennial, but I sort of have a foot in the next generation. It depends on when you think that one starts. To be honest, I think a more accurate date for Gen Z's beginning is like somewhere like 97, 98. So I'm a bit of a cusper, but I'm not really sure. But anyway.
yeah, no, I'm in the fat part of the millennial curve. It was,
Mhm.
but it's yeah, but it's funny because I sort of skew several years younger. It didn't matter in my case. It just makes me like a younger millennial just because I grew up in Silicon Valley. And a
Mm.
lot of the sort of internet trends hit earlier. And so I often find that my sort of cultural or reference points about a lot of these things skew to somebody who's about 5 years younger than me.
Yeah.
Because of like we had iPods first and we had like a lot of these sort of
That's funny.
phenomena. I don't really remember a time when I wasn't writing my book reports based on Google searches. I mean, I don't think it was even Google then. It was like Netscape or whatever, but like based on internet research. But in any case, regardless of the sort of battle of the generations, but I do believe that generational quote unquote like stereotypes are a real thing. They reflect
Mhm.
something.
Mhm.
Which obviously there are plenty of individual exceptions and there are plenty of people who are not stereotypical of their generation. But I mean, for example, one of the things I always found really unfair was the stereotype applied to millennials that millennials were lazy. Um, I really don't think that one was ever true. I really think that was boomers looking at their younger employees who were doing things related to computers and thinking they just sit there on the computers all day. Because that one has never been kind of true. In fact, I see the opposite, and especially in the archetype that you're talking about, that millennials never stop moving. They're kind of corporately ambitious.
Mhm.
Um, I think of millennials fundamentally as kind of the good kids, but they learned as the good kids who followed what their parents said, but what their parents said was sort of all of the worst of the cultural revolution and especially the sexual revolution of the boomers.
Yeah.
Um, but I don't know. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to like get off track and start
No, that's okay.
divining the lines between Gen Z and
It's such an interesting
Millennial.
topic, especially now because it's become they've become I feel like generations have become identity groups in a unique way. w- uh, Whereas before they would have just sort of been in the background of your life, I guess. But they've really become kind of to Mary Eberstadt's point, like it's a new way of identifying. It's like a new form of identity politics almost.
Another identity that we can put on TikTok and Twitter. Uh,
Right, right. And
but
astrology too.
that's one thing I've never been able to stand. I really have a hard time taking it seriously because it usually comes from the same people who say things like, "Why would you read the Bible? Because it's why would you read what your sky fairy said in a Bronze Age book or whatever it is?" And they have such a surface level understanding of 2,000-year-old religions, but they're like, "Oh, the stars predict my life." It's always been particularly difficult for me to like to
Yeah.
not laugh in people's faces when they take it seriously. Anyway, but you did bring up about sort of this corporatism angle, and you write about that and speak about that as well. Um, and I'm wondering what you think the relationship between capitalism and this kind of female empowerment is, right? You kind of tracked it from the 70s into the 80s into the 90s, girl power era, and then now into the 2000s with girl bossing, and now kind of an aesthetic critique, at least, of that. We'll see about the deeper critique. And I think you're probably right that it'll only be a small minority of people who actually take the philosophical critique seriously. But, what's the relationship between essentially corporate culture
Yeah.
and the girl boss archetype?
Great question. So, you know what? Um, I think that it's there's a third player here, which is secularization or at least the removal of um, God and family as the sort of center. God is the focal point of a society, and the family as a sort of like uh, um, most basic political unit. I think that changing, and godlessness, and then also the individual becoming the sort of prioritized, most basic, the atomized individual becoming like the center of our political life. I think that is what sort of unleashed capitalism in a way that was just sort of all consuming, so that corporations felt free to seek more labor, to cheapen labor, because line go up sort of mentality. Um, and that was sort of that was beginning in the mid-century, sort of a post-war mentality. I am not an anti-capitalist. I think that free markets are great, but I believe that they must be restrained by a properly ordered conception of the human person, subject to the creator, and as a member of a living community. So I think that a big part of the feminist story has been this unleashing of the corporate world to I don't know, break up families, to make essentials very expensive. I mean, I know that the corporations didn't say like, oh, we're gonna make houses expensive today, but like the way it's just a domino that fell when we invited women into the workplace, killing the family wage. That becomes the two income trap, which becomes like unaffordable housing now. So that's sort of how I feel about it. I don't know. I don't take. There are a lot of people on the right now who are, I think, critical of capitalism, but I think that it's important to be very specific about what kind of things you're talking about there. It's just too broad a brush.
Yeah, I'm probably with you. I'm still definitely a capitalist. I think the free market is an excellent economic system. I think what we're really pointing to is the fact that there are spheres of life that are non-economic,
Mm-hmm.
where maximizing capitalism is very, very good at maximizing material prosperity. But that is not the only kind of prosperity. I think that's what maybe from the sort of agnostic atheist perspective versus your Catholic perspective, but that's what you're pointing to about correctly understanding the human person. I think what you're pointing to there is probably there are goods other than the material. And
Right.
at those goods, capitalism is particularly bad because it's so effective, right? It's capitalism is a great mechanism for giving people what they want and what they'll pay for. And the problem is, a lot of things that people want aren't good for them and aren't
Yeah,
good for society.
totally.
And that's not a flaw we're going to correct in human nature, right? It's not in the same way that the Soviets believe they could build a new, sort of altruistic man who wasn't motivated by self-interest, and therefore they could do away with an economic system based on self-interest. It's almost the same critique to me, or a similar or a hand-in-hand critique, to say that yeah, because man is self-interested, and because man often wants things that are not good for him, or her in this case, that capitalism cannot provide the kind of moral um, structures in a society that it's being relied on to provide. I think in the absence of what you're saying, in the absence of other structures. But that doesn't mean that I don't like capitalism, or that I think that we need to switch. And in fact, oftentimes, and this is where I push back against some of the dissonant right folks, like it's not at all clear to me that a more socialistic system removes some of those barriers. It seems to me a lot of the atomization is coming from prosperity, and in that sense capitalism is creating the prosperity, therefore it's creating some of this atomization. But socialistic programs can create that too, right? What is social
Hmm.
security other than one fewer reason that you need to have children, for example?
Right.
Because the public guarantees your old age. It used to be that before this kind of welfare net, if you didn't have children and your family didn't have children and everybody kind of made the decision not to invest in the future in that way, then when you couldn't physically work anymore, you were out of luck. Um, so there are ways in which the socialistic society absolutely also empowers a certain type of atomization. Um, but I guess what else about this sphere is going away? Because it seems to me that a lot of your remarks are pointing towards a kind of a hole in our society for the non-material, as we just discussed. I mean, the falling away of women into the workforce, and I'm describing it that way because they're falling away from something. And it's
Mm.
not only within their private family lives, it's also in a sort of public or political way. Um, are we looking at essentially the death of the private sphere or the domestic sphere, whatever you want, however you would like to define that? Actually, that's itself is a good question, right? Like,
Yeah.
what do you think is the sphere that is non-material, and what has in the past, what have women's roles been in maintaining that, and how can we sort of create a society in which there is such a thing as a domestic or private sphere in the capital P political sense?
Uh, Great point. And actually, I was thinking about this today because Yoram had tweeted something about how so many of the Enlightenment rationalist thinkers were single men who never had children. And this is now the sort of materialist ideology that dominates our world, right? And I mean, even Adam Smith's mother cooked his meals for most of his life. That's a form of labor that can't be quantified. I mean, not it because it's unpaid, but it's important, and we wouldn't have the wealth of nations if Lady Margaret hadn't provided that for him. So, I guess to answer your question, I think the domestic sphere is falling apart, and people are running away from it because not because it's unpaid, but because we cannot recognize unpaid labor and unquantifiable, immeasurable acts of service. We can't recognize those things as having dignity and inherently dignified, inherently honorable, because we have this like rationalist material brain. And capitalism and communism are just two sides of that coin. It's whether you want to maximize it individually or share it with everybody, which was that's their stated aims. But let's be real about the communists. No, but anyway, so yeah, so I think that what are we falling away from? We're falling away from a family life because we no longer have the vocabulary, the mindset, the sort of cultural heritage, the impulse to recognize to recognize really love as an acts of love as having status, as being things worthy of status, I guess you could say.
Yeah, and there are few creatures on Earth more status conscious than women, and I don't actually mean that as an insult to women at all. I think it serves a valid purpose, biological purpose. But you're right that it's always going to be hard to ask women to do things that don't confer a certain amount of social status. But how do you rebuild that kind of impulse? I mean, is it even possible to rebuild that kind of impulse in a self-aware way, or is it all kind of a doomed LARP, I guess? If once you lose that instinctual kind of impulse towards those things.
Right.
What
Well,
happens? What happens to ersatz women of our generation?
I think that I think part of the reason why Jordan Peterson was so powerful and affected so many people is because he, for the first time in a long time, started pointing to archetypes, started pointing to like mythic, deep things of like deep psychological significance that are in myths, and sort of connecting those dots for people, you know. And the truth in that and the brilliance in that is because people need these stories to make sense of their lives. I think we redignify that role by holding up an archetype of woman that is, worthy of love, respect, and admiration, and seeing her in the women that we know, and choosing to sort of recognize like an archetype of a good woman, and emulate an archetype of a good woman. So, this is the only place I personally have been able to recognize like a real revivification of the domestic sort of realm is in my Catholic friend circles, you know, because we have that archetype in Mary. And it's a pretty specifically Catholic thing. I think there are a lot of Protestants who kind of want to diminish or disregard that role as sort of, she's, she's just another woman. But, Catholics are very into Mary. We love Mary. But it's actually a very effective social tool because she dignifies women in a sort of like broad societal psychological level. And I think that's kind of what it takes. I think that because, right now in the broader society, the more easily recognizable, easily digestible, frequently consumed image of woman is like a woman in a porno. I don't know. I think it has to do something with that, something to do with storytelling, with these like myths and history, and by the way, I'm not saying Mary was mythological. Okay, let me just like back that up. That's heretical. That's not what I said. But I hope you understand what I'm saying. But yeah.
I understand that you've come down on one side of the Madonna versus horror complex here.
Sure, yes.
You picked a team. No, but I could imagine there being multiple archetypes, right?
Oh, for sure. I mean, we have Mary Magdalene too.
But still having to do with, I guess, the cultivation of traditional feminine virtues as distinct from masculine ones. So yeah, I think that's a really interesting answer, actually, and I think that's probably more true in what I observe, or how, especially for women, like, and I actually just don't know about men because I'm not one in this regard, but I know for myself, like, I'm very influenced by, especially like aesthetic archetypes, or I feel like I can bear just about anything in life as long as I have a sort of model in my head of what that would mean. And I think there is that impulse of mimetic sort of slotting yourself in to a particular, even if it doesn't fully describe every aspect of yourself, but that's kind of not the point, right? That would be the sort of millennial narcissistic answer to it. Oh, I don't see myself represented in this, but instead it's something to strive towards, that gives a sort of dignity to something that may not be sort of immediately gratifying, or as Alex Kashuda always says, tickle your limbic system.
That's so good. I love all of her little aphorisms. They're so good. She's like just the best at that. I mean, gosh.
I guess speaking of the Madonna horror complex, what is this sort of contradictory ball? Help me untangle this contradictory sort of ball of impulses within the, speaking of archetypes, that right back to the girl boss archetype. Um, because something that's always driven me mad about this conception in our culture is a sort of schizophrenic view on sexuality, that I think you're actually pointing to. You came down on one side of the Madonna whore complex, but the modern equivalent of that is probably the sort of sexless automaton in the boardroom and OnlyFans playgirl outside of
Oh,
it,
I see what you're
right?
saying. Yeah.
And there's almost this very like desexed and very unerotic conception of women in the workplace, to the point of, if a man puts his hand on your thigh, you've been, horribly assaulted, and the
Hmm.
company owes you money for your trauma, right? So that on the one hand, but then on the other hand, this extremely aggressive sort of sexuality that does seem to be a part of this girl boss archetype, right? That
Mm.
she has a lot of casual sex, she goes on a lot of like Tinder hookups, um, and is really dedicated to this concept of having sexual relationships without kind of the attachment or intimacy.
Mm.
That's, and I'm not, again, like you said, I'm not talking about any particular person. I'm just, this is part of this archetype, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it very literally collides, where a lot of the women that I've known who sort of fall into the girl boss category that I've worked with, for example, when I did have a less ideological job, and I did more, um, a lot of those women even dress very sexually aggressively at work,
Yeah.
right? In ways that are almost daring to,
Mm.
like, it almost seems to me like to be a dare to people around them, like, oh, you're supposed to treat me as a sexless automaton, but here, look at my cleavage and my legs,
Mm.
um, while you do that. But I'm wondering how you can untangle for me this just like giant ball of impulses related to uh sort of asexuality almost on the one hand, or de-eroticization and like hyper sexuality and eroticization on the
Yeah.
other hand. Like what makes sense of that for me?
Gosh, I wish I could. Let me think about it. I don't know. What is that? I talk about it a lot. I mean, and it is totally schizophrenic. It's like, um, but I suppose what it uh, is they're united in that they're both cheap and shoddy imitations of what is understood as sort of a male behavior. Um, the 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 all business serious blah 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 thing, and also like the spread my seed far and wide thing. Like these are both. It's just like it's. I don't know. It's schizophrenic because women aren't supposed to act this way in either capacity. Because I think women naturally at work are interested in people and I mean, I was actually talking with some of the guys at NatCon who run a great business and who have a couple of women in the office. And we're just talking about how like, no, it's actually like, well, these women, first of all, they have very full lives. And when what they bring to the workplace is like uniquely female, and they are feminine, and they sort of they provide a certain social glue and peacemaking sort of capabilities that are really quite refreshing and conducive to success, right? Um, and so women can add things like this to work. Like I think anybody who's adding what their true gifts and sort of offering that to other people is doing a good thing. It's when you get into these cheap imitations where you get a more confused outcome, probably. So yeah, I don't know. I think that's probably what both of those things are. It's just cheap imitations of the worst kind of man.
Yeah, you pointed there to a contradiction in sort of the diversity thinking, right? Women are interchangeable or identical with men. They're not really adding any kind of anything unique even to the workplace, right?
Right.
If they're interchangeable with men, they're not bringing anything different to the table. There's always been that kind of that contradiction, I think, in a certain type of feminism, where on the one hand, if women ruled the world, there'd be no war, and on the other hand, right, women and men are the same. And these things
Yes.
are obviously not compatible. But how I want to wrap up with this question. How did you come to some of these conclusions? I mean, um, did you grow up in a traditional family, or did you find your way to a lot of these conclusions via sort of observation or poor experience, or how
Yeah.
did you get where you are on a lot of these questions?
Well, that's a good question too. No, I didn't. I wasn't raised in a traditional home. I kind of learned the hard way. I think some combination of observation and bad experience. I think I've always been just a bit of an outsider. I grew up in the South, and my parents were Yankees, so so I think I've always been sort of if you could say maybe I came to be comfortable in a more observational role, which is probably why I grew up and became a writer. But yeah, I don't know. It was some combination of observing other people and then observing myself, and also I will say it's not all bad. Like, I think some of my best ideas and my clearest understanding of what has happened has been through the very redemptive experience of marriage, and having a relationship with with a man that was that is inherently dignified, and who helps me think things out and sort of forces logic. This sounds silly as it's coming out of my mouth, but I do mean it. Yeah, so I don't know. There are bad experiences that everybody learns from, but actually, honestly, like, my most informative things, things that motivate me now, are the fact that I love my life, and I wish desperately that I could tell my younger self, when I was having all those learning experiences, that there is a better way. And so yeah, it's just, I said this on Alex's podcast, it's just too good of news not to share.
On that uncharacteristically upbeat note for this podcast, thank you so much, Helen, for joining High Noon today. Really highly recommend Helen's writing and her work, her podcast, Girlboss Interrupted. Thanks so much for spending this close to an hour with us today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Inez.
And thank you to our listeners. High Noon with Inez Stepman is a production of the Independent Women's Forum. We have other productions of the Independent Women's Forum, such as At the Bar, which is a podcast that I do with a colleague of mine, Jennifer Braceras. We actually have an upcoming episode on the Supreme Court term. We talk about issues at the intersection of law, politics, and culture. We also have a podcast called She Thinks, which is more of a daily download into policy issues. We have a lot of really great and interesting guests over there as well. So if you're looking to understand a policy issue better, or to understand something that's in the news better, always a great place to go, She Thinks. But you can also help us out with this podcast, High Noon, by hitting the subscribe button, leaving us a comment or review on Apple Podcasts, Acast, Google Play, YouTube, or IWF.org. Be brave, and we'll see you next time on High Noon.